Today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome back Michel to the channel. This is our third conversation. He is the head of Combating Kleptocracy Program at the Human Rights Foundation, focusing on how dictators and autocrats use illicit finance and dirty money to remain in power. That, of course, as you'll have guessed, is an extremely hot topic once again. He's the author of American Kleptocracy on America's transformation into an offshore haven. He's also had another book out recently called Foreign Agents, where he examines the explosion of foreign lobbying in Washington and how that industry has helped entrench dictatorships and upend American foreign policy. Well, we're going to be looking at a whole range of issues, including foreign policy, corruption, oligarchy, and so on, as these topics, I think, are intrinsic to the sort of chaos that we see unfolding in the world. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Thank you so much to everyone who supports the channel. Thank you to everyone who's subscribed, who likes, shares, reshares the videos, and especially to those who have bought me a coffee or become a patron. As you know, that is incredibly important to help keep this work going. And thank you also to everybody who helped us to finance the trip to Ukraine, the events we ran there, which we filmed, put on the channel. We've got more of those events and interviews to come. And we are instituting a much more, I would say, adventurous program through the year of doing more events. So if you want to help support that, please do check out our Buy Me a Coffee page on that. Now I've got all that out of the way. Casey, welcome back to the channel.
Jonathan, thanks so much for having me.
We have probably far more things to discuss than we possibly can fit in to the sort of 45 minutes or so. Let's start with your overview. I mean, we discussed before hitting the record button that it's very difficult to keep in touch with what is actually going on. And indeed, that is a strategy, isn't it? To keep us distracted from the fire hose of sort of nonsense and craziness and announcements and trolling. This is a strategy to keep us deflected from what's really going on. So that's my question to you. What is it they don't want us to see? And why is this fire hose of distraction in operation?
Well, look, that is a wonderful question, Jonathan. And it's not only a difficulty to stay on top of what the news actually is, what the developments actually are, and of course, the entire news cycle itself. But as you and I were discussing off mic just a few moments ago, it's also to this day, still nearly a decade after Donald Trump's rise to politics in the United States of America, difficult even to differentiate between what he is saying, what he is gesturing at, where he's getting his information from, and what the actual policy on the ground is. Look, if this was easy, I suppose a lot more folks would be doing it. I suppose a lot more folks would be significantly less exhausted than I know I certainly am, drinking plenty more coffee these days than I used to in my younger days. But it's not easy, and it's not going to be getting any easier anytime soon. But as you mentioned also, this is part of a broader strategy. As former Trump advisor and potentially continued Trump consigliere Steve Bannon says, they want to flood the zone. They want to move at, as he says, muzzle velocity, keep everyone exhausted, keep everyone overwhelmed with all of the news, whether it pertains to domestic policy, foreign policy, Russia policy, Ukraine policy, anti-corruption policy, counter-kleptocracy policy, on and on and on. And certainly in the last few weeks of Donald Trump's new administration, it is moving at a far greater clip than at least I remember it moving in his first term, and I suspect it won't be ending anytime soon.
Well, let's focus firstly then. We're going to get to Ukraine. We're going to get to Bannon and Musk making, fascistic salutes and all the kind of, sort of cosplay fascism that we see. But let's actually tackle that one thing. What can we see actually changing? What policies are actually being enacted? We see US aid eviscerated, in fact, shut down. We see institutions of governance eviscerated of their staff, capabilities, expertise. In some instances, they've had to desperately try to rehire people, apparently, as new crises have broken. And we see, in particular, corruption and transparency organizations being targeted. Could you give us a bit of detail on that and whether we have any early signs of judicial organizations or organizations around sort of electoral process being targeted as well?
So That's a great question, Jonathan. I can say with full confidence that here we are on the 25th of February. Trump has been in office for a little over a month now. I can certainly say on my end, the past month has been, without question, the single worst month in terms of anti-corruption and counter-kleptocracy policy in the United States of America, and has been the month in which we can pinpoint that we can look to say this is when the United States of America ended its leadership role in terms of combating transnational corruption, illicit finance, white-collar criminality writ large that has all manner of knock-on effects for, again, things like Ukraine policy or Russia policy, let alone sanctions policy moving forward. There was a time not very long ago in which the United States of America had a role as the leader of the democratic world in terms of targeting malign actors and malign networks, targeting dirty money around the world as well as domestically, and setting the model for what other democracies followed. You can go all the way back to 1977, the aftermath of the Watergate hearings, when the United States of America passed a whole series of sweeping reforms, including something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the FCPA, in 1977, which was the very first piece of legislation that made it illegal for, in this case, Americans, to bribe not just American officials, but foreign officials elsewhere. Made it a crime to engage in bribery in other nations and with other officials. This was unlike anything we had ever seen previously, and this set the model for what anti-corruption policy looked like, both in the United States of America as well as across the democratic world. It's no surprise that places like France and Germany, Canada, the United Kingdom later followed suit and implemented their own versions of it. This was the bedrock of the United States of America's anti-corruption policy that everything else built out from. And certainly we can talk about some of those other secondary policies as well. But it was this Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that was at the heart of the U.S.'s anti-corruption policies and anti-corruption leadership. And in his very first month back in office, Donald Trump, with his giant black marker of a pen, signed an executive order announcing they would be halting all enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. In effect, they were gutting it completely. Now, because it's an act of Congress, it can't be repealed without another act of Congress. But what Trump was announcing was that his administration, his Department of Justice, was no longer going to be enforcing that bedrock piece of legislation, bedrock piece of the U.S.'s anti-corruption playbook. Now, I can only imagine the kind of signal flare that this sends not only to other democracies that are watching what the U.S. is doing in terms of demolishing its anti-corruption credentials, but of course, corrupt foreign officials, corrupt foreign oligarchs, corrupt foreign kleptocrats, and some of the crooked American businessmen who are all too happy to pay off to benefit and to entrench those corrupt foreign regimes around the world. Now, I should say that it is not every American company that is champing at the bit for this. The small and medium-sized American firms don't have the resources to engage in this kind of bribery, but further saw the FCPA as this kind of shield to prevent rapacious foreign oligarchs and foreign regimes from coming to them. Because when those regimes would come to them, and they certainly did, these American firms, smaller and medium-sized firms, can say, I'm sorry, we can't bribe you. We will be prosecuted if we do. So, thanks, but no thanks. That shield is now gone, and the only people benefiting are the most corrupt kleptocratic regimes around the world, not least places like Russia.
So that clearly will benefit, as you say, external actors. Who specifically in the US will benefit? Is this a corporate class? Is this an oligarchic class we're talking about?
It's absolutely an oligarchic class, Jonathan. This has been one of the clear differentiating markers of Trump 2.0 versus Trump first administration, is the rise of this kind of oligarchic nexus out of the private sector. Certainly, we all saw it at Trump's inauguration with Mark Zuckerberg, with Jeff Bezos, with Sundar Pichai of Google, and of course with Elon Musk of X, of Tesla, of SpaceX, so on and so forth, being the primary benefactor, the primary bankroller of Trump's reelection, and of course now acting as this effective parasite on the federal government, targeting department after department, even though apparently Musk still does not have an official position in the federal government, gutting them, cutting their resources, in some cases like USAID, shuttering them wholesale, and of course demanding the resignations of a wide swath of the federal government and debilitating, whether it's Department of Defense, Department of Education, Department of Treasury, the list goes on and on and on. And of course, this isn't even talking about the kind of anti-corruption efforts that have been kneecapped as a result. It is absolutely those figures with the deepest pockets and the deepest access to resources that are going to be the ones benefiting from this, and of course also those that are in the corrupt and crooked foreign regimes elsewhere. But I should say it's not just those in the private sector and those foreign governments themselves. It is folks like Donald Trump and his inner circle and his political allies, because now the foreign governments, those private sector actors, they both know full well that the only way the FCPA and other elements of America's anti-corruption portfolio are not going to be enforced, the only way that these corrupt networks can be allowed to flourish and that we are guaranteed of having a pliant Department of Justice that won't enforce this stuff, that's if Donald Trump remains in power. That's the only way to guarantee any of this. And I'm not talking about just remaining in power from 2024 to 2028, but potentially remaining in power far beyond that. We know Donald Trump is, as he says, joked about remaining for a third term, for a fourth term, et cetera, et cetera. But, look, I've been watching Donald Trump as much as the rest of the audience here. Why are we still taking these jokes as pure humor? We know that there's nothing more than access to and control of the levers of power Donald Trump desires. And now he has this whole coterie of oligarchs and, of course, foreign actors as well, who realize that their best days are ahead of them only if Donald Trump remains in power.
And of course, there is the risk that if the law changes and goes back to the original rule of law and transparency, they're then open to corruption. They're then, prosecution.
The prosecution,
Yeah,
absolutely.
it makes them extremely vulnerable. I mean, this
Mm-hmm.
is one of the reasons why Vladimir Putin has held power for so long.
You're exactly right, Jonathan. And I should say the other element of this is, yes, there are policy decisions that have been taken. I mean, one of the other things worth mentioning, of course, is that the Department of Justice under Trump has completely dissolved, eliminated all of the task forces dedicated to kleptocracy writ large, to targeting and seizing and repatriating all of the assets linked to oligarchic forces around the world, not least out of Russia. It's just funny because, of course, I expected the new administration to roll back many of these enforcement mechanisms. I didn't get any hint whatsoever that they were going to outright eliminate things like the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Initiative, things like Task Force Klepto Capture, some of which have been on the books, not just the last few years, but going all the way back 15 years now. I didn't have any hint of that whatsoever. And of course, that is devastating not only to the U.S.'s efforts to target these assets, but to roll back these networks that much further. I was going to say one other element, Jonathan, and I know there's plenty to discuss, as you can tell. Another element is that Donald Trump has also leaned on his Department of Justice to eliminate the charges, remove the charges against the mayor of our beautiful city of New York City, where I'm calling to you from today, where I'm joining you from today, who was alleged to, and very clearly laid out in the indictment, act as an effective foreign agent for the government in Turkey and solicit and accept funding from foreign nationals. Donald Trump removed those charges, and now all of a sudden you see a new paradigm emerging where Donald Trump can wield the Department of Justice to target those who are opposed to him, or if these other politicians on the ground in the United States of America want to support Donald Trump and continue supporting him, they'll have those charges removed. All of a sudden we have, it's an overused term, but very truly the weaponization of the Department of Justice wielded as a political cudgel for Donald Trump's benefit, and of course, benefiting only those corrupt actors on the ground in the US and elsewhere.
And this, of course, is, I mean, I don't want to dwell too much on this, but this is the extraordinary hypocrisy you get in many of these issues, which is they accused Biden of doing exactly the same thing by prosecuting January the 6th protesters, although, and the various prosecutions against Trump and his businesses themselves, having, looked into those all seem to be not necessarily politically motivated at all, but based on actual infringements of genuine rule of law questions. Are you talking now about they're wielding it selectively, so they're still going to go after things that are, technically illegal, but they're going to let some people off? Or are they actually going to wield it in a way that no longer pursues things that have any kind of legal precedence or validity?
Well, it can be both. There can certainly be crimes that they utilize, paper crimes, minuscule crimes, minor crimes that they can identify and certainly use the resources of the federal government to go after. But they don't even have to have those. They can simply launch an investigation for the sake of launching an investigation. And whether this is out of the Department of Justice, whether this is out of the Internal Revenue Service, whether this is the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the FBI, we know that all of these investigations, these lawsuits, et cetera, they can drain targets of resources, of time, of energy, and certainly of any desire to continue the fight for democracy and for transparency. There doesn't even need to be a crime at the root of this. The administration can well lose some of these cases, but at the end of the day, Donald Trump remains in power. The Department of Justice remains his effective stick, as well as some of these other investigative bodies. And as we have seen in other authoritarian countries, not least places like Russia, although of course Turkey, Azerbaijan, the list goes on and on. That is an incredible benefit for any kind of budding autocrat or authoritarian figure who wants to cement his role in power.
And for every person who goes up against authority, there'll be maybe 100 or 1,000 who would have done in other circumstances, but they're put off from doing so, given the huge cost they would incur under these punitive processes.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, people have livelihoods. People have colleagues who are counting on them. People have family members who are counting on them. People who have bills to pay. We all have something that can be used against us or against those forces for democracy and transparency. And everyone is going to be having to make a whole series of very personal decisions in the coming years, and we're all going to have different lines that we identify. And this is a direct outgrowth, again, of having an administration in power that certainly early indications are does not seem to desire any kind of independence for the Department of Justice or any other federal body that reports to the executive branch here in the U.S.
Let's now make that link between sort of oligarchic interests, the removal of any checks and balances that would, keep that in some kind of measured in place, and link that to foreign policy, because it seems that this sort of extortion mindset, the sort of slightly kleptocratic, oligarch-led mindset is now being applied to foreign policy. We see Trump quite clearly in plain view of the world trying to extort the victim of imperial aggression, Ukraine, by trying to say, sign up to a peace deal, even though there's no security inherent in that deal. Give us, wadges of resources which are far beyond, what has been given to Ukraine, and those were given with no strings attached. So we see this sort of this kleptocratic extortion writ large in foreign policy. Is that too harsh in your view, or is that what
Well,
is playing out?
no, I think you can see this as clearly as I can, Jonathan. This is it is rapacious, it is bullying, and it is extraction from a population and a nation that has quite literally sacrificed far more than, God willing, you or I ever have to, or Americans or Brits ever have to, moving forward simply for the sake of survival, simply for the sake of retaining any kind of sovereignty, and of course trying to beat back another kleptocratic regime that has taken root in Russia that has designs far beyond Ukraine. I mean, the Ukrainians have been fighting for all of us in the democratic world for years now, and to see an American government come in and effectively extort the Ukrainians on the ground by saying, if you don't give us hundreds of billions of dollars worth of resources, or at least set up this fund that they are claiming to be setting up themselves, we will no longer continue, presumably, to provide the kind of aid that you so desperately need in order to continue. Now, this is part and parcel of Trump's broader worldview of, again, being one of extremely rapacious, dog eat dog, might is right, so on and so forth. That is very reminiscent of what we see in Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping or potentially even Narendra Modi in India. So in that sense, it's not necessarily surprising, but I will say that I think, and this is I think where folks like you, Jonathan, and your listeners and viewers have a far more keen sense of where things could go or will go in Ukraine. I don't think they're necessarily thinking about the kind of on the ground knock on effects this would have in Ukraine itself. I mean, look, The Ukrainians have proven themselves time and again, year in, year out, that they will do whatever it takes to defend their country. And I know that they are, of course, grateful for American aid, but that American aid has been in American interest, even if Trump doesn't realize that. And if that aid does dry up, the Ukrainians aren't going anywhere. They will remember this. And I have no doubt that the fight will continue. It may be more difficult, it may take longer, but I have no doubt that they will continue pushing on and pushing forward, whether it's the Europeans writ large, the Ukrainians in particular. This is going to have all kinds of knock-on effects that I really don't think the Trump administration is even considering, and all of that will be to the diminishment of American interests in Europe, in Ukraine, moving forward.
And you mentioned at the start, where's he getting his information from? Well, we don't want to go down the sort of Tucker Carlson rabbit hole, but many of the most egregious Kremlin narratives that Trump has spouted in the last week, they come exactly a week after he actually spoke directly and at some length to Vladimir Putin. And I can imagine Putin probably told him, look, Ukraine is weak. We're winning. You don't want to side with, a loser. You want to side with us. Here's the upside. Here's the benefits. One of the real worries I have about this, of course, is the thing that, and this is why I have my doubts about Rubio and where he's going. I think Kellogg demonstrably has tried to show a reality that accords with his moral framework. As a result, he was requested not to do a press conference from Kiev, and had to put some announcements out or interviews via Ukrainian media. Rubio seems to be signing up to this idea that there'll be peace and light, and we can lift sanctions. And what I think we're gearing up for here is a dark money bonanza, where businessmen with no morals are going to try to make money hand over fist by rearming and enriching Russia.
I think you're spot on there in terms of the concerns. I mean, look, the concerns on my end, and God knows I don't want to ever give the Kremlin any credit for anything that they have done, but I think they have correctly identified the best means and mechanism for gaining support from not only the Trump administration, but Donald Trump himself, is identifying potential economic partnerships that can be sealed between Russian and American interests, whether it is gas extraction in the Arctic, other potential natural resource extraction. I suppose there are also elements of the defense industry that could benefit American firms. The Russian representative Kirill Dmitriev floated $300 billion in lost revenue for American firms. Of course, that number is going to bounce around in Donald Trump's head as a potential solution or as a potential outcome of a quote unquote peace deal that would, of course, effectively throw the Ukrainians to the wolves. I am not at all surprised that this is the route that they would potentially go down. And it's funny because, I suppose ironic, that if Vladimir Putin did successfully go to Trump and say, the Ukrainians are the losers in this, we are gaining territory, you should continue to support us, you should lift sanctions, we should find this kind of rapprochement, and to use a term that has all kind of resonance, a reset in relations between Russia and America. It's missing a little bit of key context, of course, in the fact that it is the Russians that have lost hundreds of thousands of troops, if not more, that are reliant now on foreign troops because Vladimir Putin fears a second broader mobilization that sees rampant inflation, high interest rates, and this toxic brew of stagflation that is going to be running out of all Soviet era equipment by 12, 18, 24 months from now. And that, yes, is technically gaining territory, but it's been what, the size of Delaware over the last year? We're not talking about any kind of major overthrow or overhaul of Ukrainian forces, let alone Ukrainian territory. And of course, all this while places like Sweden and Sweden and Finland have joined NATO, turning the Baltic Sea into an effective NATO lake, on and on and on. This has been a strategic nightmare for the Russians. That is what Donald Trump is missing in these conversations. And that is what is missing from these conversations about American interests, Western interests, and of course, continuing to support Ukraine moving forward.
And now potentially you may see a European rearmament. The Trump propagandists. I meant the Putin propagandists. I'm getting my names confused. They're absolutely incensed at the German election result. Yes, their guys came second, but won't be in government. It's Merz who's going to be in government, and is saying some of the strongest things I've heard not just from a German chancellor, but from any European politician in the last 3 years. He's saying Ukraine must win. We must rearm. Europe must create a security framework independent of the US, etc., etc. Extraordinary words. It'll be interesting to see if that's matched by actions. This could be a real own goal by Trump,
Yeah.
in fact.
Yeah, it's funny. I do wonder if there will be a future generation of policymakers who look back on this era and the Trumpist encouragement of European rearmament as one of these not only inflection points writ large for American strategy, but as a moment of regret in which, this is getting further afield from our conversation itself. But if I had gone back to an American policymaker 30, 40, 50 years ago, or of course pre-World War II, and said the Americans are encouraging the French, excuse me, not the Brit, the Germans, the Poles, of course, the Ukrainians, the Italians to rearm themselves. That would have been an absolutely shocking statement in and of itself. I think American primacy, American security primacy in Europe has been one of these things that folks have taken for granted, of course, for decades. But the actual positive outcome, and here I'm talking about not only European interests, but especially American interests, has been indescribable. To see the kind of peace and prosperity brought to the transatlantic relationship because of that, to say nothing of the role that NATO and NATO expansion has played in preventing not only intra-European defense issues or potentially even wars themselves, but even potentially nuclear proliferation in Europe, across the European continent itself. These are all the kind of effects of American security primacy and a NATO expansion that folks just don't think about, that they just don't discuss, that I think a lot of folks, if this American retrenchment does continue, to say nothing of Russian expansionism, I think a lot of folks are going to be regretting in future years and in future administrations because of these direct decisions and policy outcomes of Donald Trump.
Now, many people are going to look at this and thinking, okay, I was for Trump, but I don't like some of the things he's doing and saying, but I don't quite see how he benefits personally from all this. Therefore, they're thinking, okay, he's still acting in what he thinks is the best interests of the American people, etc., etc. Let's turn to Trump coin, his
Sure.
cryptocurrency, which some commentators suggested is one of the most extraordinary vehicles for, below the radar corruption ever invented. And he launched it pretty much on day one of his presidency.
I don't think it's too much of an overstatement. Of course, I have covered many of the avenues, not least of all property and luxury real estate that has benefited Trump and the Trump organization, of course, allowed all manner of foreign regimes, whether it's out of Russia or Kazakhstan or places like the Republic of Congo, places like Haiti, where corrupt leaders can plow millions of dollars into Trump and Trump luxury properties. And of course, that's only a small portion of the broader Trump real estate portfolio that we know about. But even the real estate elements, that's kind of small bore compared to what this meme coin is. There was another analyst I was listening to the other day who described it as effectively broadcasting the account information for a Swiss bank account for any and all to directly bankroll. And I think it's worth, look, it's one thing for me to say that, and it's one thing, I have my own personal politics. That's all fine and good. And of course, I'm not a fan of what Donald Trump and the Trump administration has been doing in terms of anti-corruption policy or Ukraine policy, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's indicative that even one of the biggest support structures for Donald Trump's reelection, and that was the broader crypto industry, they have been frankly apoplectic about what this Trump coin, this Melania coin have represented, because the crypto industry writ large has been trying to be kind of brought in from the cold, trying to gain the kind of legitimacy that certainly those in this space have sought for years. And they thought that they were going to get that with the Trump administration. And all of a sudden, on the eve of his inauguration, here is Donald Trump launching what is effectively just a money laundering vehicle, a way to directly bankroll a sitting president. And it doesn't have to be just a few $1,000,000 here and a few $1,000,000 there, which we've seen with his luxury real estate apartments and condos. I mean, there's no bottom to how much this Trump a coin, this meme coin, can take in from any a single source. And again, I don't think it's any surprise, and to an extent, my heart goes out to them, these crypto bigwigs who thought that they were gaining all of this legitimacy because of the Trump administration, all of a sudden to watch that blown to smithereens by this one decision that Donald Trump took right on the eve of inauguration.
Absolutely extraordinary. And of course, there will be potentially some oligarchic interest in that as well. If you get in there early, you've got enough money, you can maybe sort of ride that wave as well. But back to the sort of political question of oligarchy, it seems to me that some of these conversations, people in the media, etc., have been focusing on the fact of the resources. Now they decide to look at, well, maybe it's, more complex than that because where are the greatest facilities in the world for turning raw materials into usable commodities? Well, actually, a lot of them are in China. So there's some flies in the ointment, even with this resources extortion kind of plan around there. But what it perhaps also points to, I think, is the desire on the part of Russia and now by extension Trump to reintroduce the concept of oligarchic rule in Ukraine. They don't just want to make Ukraine, if they can't control it, conquer it, etc., then at least they'll want a return of some oligarchic interest into the territory. Are we seeing the oligarchization of foreign policy? Are we seeing that in the US? And will they try to impose that on Europe and allies as well through various mechanisms?
I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Jonathan. I love that phrase, the oligarchization of foreign policy. We saw elements of this in Trump's first administration with open access to a number of oligarchic networks out of, again, Russia or Turkey or China, or including Ukraine. I think it's worth recalling that there was one Ukrainian oligarch who initially peddled the so-called dirt on Joe Biden, creating the kind of network that ended up accessing Donald Trump, that ended up blowing up in his very first impeachment trial. That was Dmitry Firtash, who had previously claimed to be a patriotic Ukrainian oligarch, or excuse me, Ukrainian businessman, who was later indicted by the United States of America. 10 years later, is still awaiting extradition. But a whole series of other Ukrainian oligarchs then followed suit, trying to peddle this information, again, so-called dirt on Joe Biden to Donald Trump. I have no doubt that that is continuing and has continued. And I wouldn't be surprised. And this gets to where things like these sudden calls for elections in Ukraine come into play. Of course, I would like to think Donald Trump is perfectly aware that the Ukrainian constitution bars elections during wartime for perfectly understandable reasons. Not every country does. Here in the United States, we have had elections previously in wartime, but again, the Ukrainian constitution bars that completely. I would not at all be surprised if the rationale undergirding this not only emanates from the Kremlin, the kind of talking points emanate from the Kremlin, but the idea is that if there are elections that are held, these oligarchic forces can force Zelenskyy out, can reclaim power in Kiev, and can disseminate that power again, whether it's to the regions or to Kremlin proxies, et cetera, and return the kind of oligarchic rule that Ukrainians have overthrown multiple times in the 21st century. I think it's also continues to be an underrated element of Zelensky's leadership in Ukraine that he has not only led an anti-oligarchization effort in Ukraine, but been successful at it even during wartime, including some of the folks that he was previously close to, like Igor Kolomoisky, who I wrote about extensively in my first book for his own money laundering network in the United States of America. I think that's an underrated element of Zelensky's leadership, and I think it's an underrated ingredient in these new forces arraying around Zelensky's leadership in Ukraine moving forward.
So, if Trump is not necessarily working in the best interests of working Americans, but we go with the conclusion that he is working for oligarch interests, we'll come to, I mean, the last question will be about sort of international order institutions and what he needs to remove to allow this modus operandi to extend. But isn't there a risk here that he's going far beyond his mandate? He's going far beyond popular opinion in many of the things he says, including cozying up to Putin. The majority of Americans don't really like this. They don't like Putin, and many, fewer than in the UK, but many see him as a dictator and are not comfortable with what's going on. Will he get pushed back? Or will he be successful in starting to normalize some of the really what are considered extreme and outrageous things he's saying and doing?
Jonathan, it's a great question. Before we started recording today, we talked about elements of optimism that we see moving forward. One thing I hadn't mentioned that I tried to retain, on my end over the last month or so is that this past month was absolutely, understandably, and maybe even rightfully so, this kind of honeymoon period that any new president or returning president generally enjoys after an inauguration. Typically, it lasts for 100 days or so, maybe a few months. In Joe Biden's case, we saw it last at least until the pullout from Afghanistan. But this honeymoon period generally attaches itself to almost every president. Donald Trump did not necessarily have one during his first term because of certain outcomes, certain quirks of the electoral system in the United States of America. But much of what we have seen over the past few weeks has taken place during Donald Trump's honeymoon period. Now, it does seem like that is coming to an end, and it does seem like that is a result of the kind of overreach and overstretch that you are talking about itself. There was no domestic constituency for rolling back things like anti-corruption reform, for decimating the U.S.'s role as an anti-corruption leadership. Of course, things like preventing corporate bribery. I don't know where the domestic constituency for that in the United States of America is. And there still is a wide base 55, 60, 65% support for the Ukrainians in the United States of America. I would love to see that higher. I would love to see that 100%, but in this country, we're not going to see anything at those levels. And we still have very minimal support for Vladimir Putin in Moscow. And I have no doubt that if there is some kind of quote unquote grand bargain struck out of the Trump administration with Moscow, that will redound to Trump's diminishment in the American public's eyes. That will only increase the kind of downslope that we have seen in terms of approval ratings and support for his administration that much more. I would like to think he realizes that. I would like to think he understands the kind of political calculation that needs to go into these decisions. I don't know that he does. It's certainly possible that he thinks, since he has the levers of power over Department of Justice, IRS, FBI, the list goes on, he can simply do what he wants. But I suspect he will swiftly learn otherwise if he continues to have this kind of overreach that we have seen over the past few weeks.
And the last question really is if his grand strategy is this sort of oligarch mindset with a sort of extraction-based obsession. We see that in conversations around Canada. We see that in conversations around Greenland, etc. Very much focused on what can we get our hands on before the other guys do. Seems to be the way it works. But he's going to need to dismantle an awful lot of institutions and legal culture, etc., to get at this, as well as NGOs and so on. So in that context, US aid decision starts to make sense. A lot of the other stuff, the evisceration of government and good governance, checks and balances under the guise of radical libertarianism also makes sense, because you need to remove anything that can resist the new mode of business, as it were, and become more like Putin. Putin doesn't have these checks and balances. He can operate freely. I want to be like him. What should we look at in the coming days, weeks, and months? Goodness me, even imagining months of this on end is difficult. But what should we look at in terms of what's kind of worrying around threats to institutions and so on?
Well, certainly the first thing I would do for folks who are watching this perhaps for the first time is to subscribe to your YouTube channel, Jonathan, so they can stay up to date on all of the leading conversations and policy discourse in this space. But I suppose more particularly, there are two elements of things that I would watch, that I'll be watching on my end moving forward, as these elements of autocratic impulse are brought to bear in Washington and elsewhere. One is the usage of state investigatory vehicles, for lack of I suppose, a better term. And again, I just rattle off a few of them: Department of Justice, IRS, and FBI, most especially. This kind of usage of investigation as a means of harassment, as a means of silencing, and a means of targeting either political opponents or even pro-transparency advocates themselves. We already saw the gutting of USAID, which had been one of the leading bodies for anti-corruption policy in the U.S. That was certainly a first salvo, but I would recommend watching for and become extremely concerned about is the usage of investigations as the means of, again, harassment, silencing, and intimidation, even if those investigations don't end up leading anywhere. That's one element. The other element is more particular. There's been a bill kind of bouncing around Congress the last few months at this point, maybe the last year. So it hasn't gone anywhere. But one thing I will be watching for moving forward is a bill that whose name escapes me, but what it effectively does is it makes it far easier for the executive branch to remove nonprofit status from nonprofits here in the United States of America, NGOs, civil society, and the like. Now, much of that has been pitched around supposed terrorist financing or support for terrorists that these NGOs illustrate. And I have certainly written previously that the American nonprofit sector needs far more transparency as it pertains to things like foreign funding, oligarchic funding, and of course funding from places like the Kremlin or China, or the list goes on and on. But there's a bill that would make it extremely easy for nonprofits to have that status removed and subject them to what would be effectively very punishing taxation that these organizations do not have the resources for. And it's difficult for me to think of a better way or a quicker way to have these organizations go belly up and effectively dissolve than to have the nonprofit status removed almost overnight. So that's in terms of the legislative element, what I'm looking for, and of course investigations in the executive branch as well. That's what I'm going to be watching for moving forward.
Well, we'll definitely be catching up on that. Given the current state of things, I think a fire hose of news. We could probably speak tomorrow and we'd have enough material to fill another hour. But for today, Katie, thank you so much for everything you write, everything you do, and your resistance to the kleptocratic illegality, which is a rising tide in the world. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. It's been great to speak with you today.